Today we're going to learn how to create functions using other functions that we've already written before. It might be a function that you've written yourself or that somebody else wrote. To start out with, I'm going to look at this example of a function that I already wrote called sum of numbers. It involves concepts that we haven't discussed yet in class, such as looping to process all of the items inside a list. Let's read the description of the function. Returns the sum of a list of numbers. There's even an example of how to use it. Sum of numbers, pass in a list, and then this particular list should output 18 for the sum. Notice how we use def to define the function. We chose a name for the function. It only has one input. From the example here, it looks like it has three, but because they're all in a list, it's a single collection or a single container of multiple things. So it only has one variable name. Notice how it is plural. I put an S at the end to remind myself that even though it's just one variable name, it does represent multiple things inside. Then use the colon at the end. So I'm going to hit run so that I can define this function. I'm going to copy this example right here and just see how it works. Looks like 18. I'm going to hit up and go back and make the list a little bit bigger. And it looks like it's working. I could even go up and remove things from the list. Notice how, since it's a list, I can change the amount of things inside of it, but it's always just going to be one variable in here. Now, the whole point of this lesson today is to figure out how can you use a function in another function. So I'm going to create another function, and now I want a function that returns the average of a list of numbers. I'll give an example of how to use it. So you say average of numbers. I'll just use the same list in the previous example. And since the sum was 18, now since there are 3 items in the list, so 18 divided by 3 is 6, so this should return 6. I'm going to define average of numbers. And this time, you could call the variable the same thing. It takes numbers. I'm going to show you that this time, let's say I want to call it nums for my input variable. You get to choose whenever you're creating a function what your input variable is called. So you want to choose something that makes sense, that describes the input very well. For example, a list is a container of multiple things, so I used something that was plural. Since this is a function that does an average, I called it nums. If this was a function that was taking a list that could have words or numbers, maybe I would call this items, something less specific. So one thing I know that I need for the average is the number of items. So I know how to find the number of items using a function that's built into Python called the len function. So I take the length of my list, the list is called nums, and that's how many items there are. Or I could have called this the number of numbers, anything that makes sense. Or I could have chosen not to store this in a variable, and I could have just typed len nums whenever I needed it. The next thing I need is the total, the sum of all these numbers when you add them up. You might be tempted to just come up here, since you see there's a function that's already done it, copy that code and come back here and paste it. But you don't need to do that. Whenever there's an existing function, all you have to do is use the name of the function, and then you can do the same thing in just one line calling that function. So I'm going to say that the total is equal to, and then I'm going to use the name of the function, sum of the numbers, and then I'm going to pass in a list. Notice how I haven't created any lists. The only lists right now is this list right here, the input list to the function. So without even knowing what it is, I'm just going to pass this list into this function, sum of the numbers. And then it's going to be called right here. That same list is going to be copied into this variable numbers, and then this function will do its job, and then I will get the sum returned from this. Notice how I took the result from sum of numbers and stored it in a variable called total. I'm going to say return total divided by num items. I'm going to hit run so that it defines the functions, and then let's try it out. Make sure that works. Let's add an extra number on there, like 100. That should bring the average up a lot. So now the average is 29.5. So it seems to be working. You should do more extensive testing of your functions just to make sure. But for right now, it seems to be working. Let's go back to this function and talk about a few changes that could make it a little bit shorter and easier to read. Num items isn't really a better name than len nums. Len nums is pretty easy to understand what it is. It's the length of the number, so that's how many things there are. So instead of storing a variable, I could have just as easily just used len nums right there. Then I wouldn't need this line of code. Next one, total means pretty much the same thing as the sum of the numbers. So I didn't really need to create this extra variable to store the sum of the numbers. It's fine that I did, but if I didn't want to, I could just take this right here and put it in place of total, and then I wouldn't need this line to store. And then all my function would do is say return sum of the numbers divided by the length of the numbers. And this is pretty easy to understand. You can see it's finding the sum of the numbers, how many there are, and dividing them, and it's easily understandable as finding the average.